I'm here to introduce to you the Honorable United States Assistant Secretary of Labor for Disability of Employment Policy, Kathleen Martinez. I just wanted to highlight that through her constant leadership on strategic planning for disability policy initiatives, Assistant Secretary Martinez has truly moved a dial on employment opportunities for Americans with disabilities. Assistant Secretary Martinez also advocates and publishes on an array of topics related to disability employment. For instance, the emergence of disability as an essential component in the 21st century in the workplace diversity. As an emerging leader with a disability, I'm moved by Ms. Martinez's emphasis on the importance of expectations ensuring youth with disabilities grow with the assumption of work, and that the topic upon which Ms. Martinez, who herself was born blind, offers a personal perspective. As a young woman with this disability, Kathy's story is a great source of inspiration because she not only reminds me, but all of us, that just because we have a disability does not mean we are below anybody else. We are much more than what society perceives us to be. And it is my honor, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce a fellow fierce advocate for justice, Kathleen Martinez.
Wow, what an introduction. That was actually the best introduction that anybody's ever given me because I didn't read that really boring bio that the Department of Labor prepares. So thank you, Grace, and thank you for your inspiration and leadership. As President Travis said, some of us are moving up there in age, and we are blessed to have leadership like you. I wouldn't say emerging, but already existing. And I know that someday you'll probably be president. So I'm thrilled that I'm here, and I'm thrilled that John Jay College is actually taking time in their conference schedule to have a day on Olmstead. As most of you know, Olmstead was a landmark event in disability rights history, and it directly impacts much of our work at the U.S. Department of Labor Office of Disability Employment Policy, or ODEP. So I'm most grateful for the opportunity to provide my perspective on the impact of Olmstead. Because Olmstead was and still is incredibly significant. And understanding its significance and the implications involved in implementing the decision with fidelity is critically important to the future of youth and adults with disabilities throughout our country. Now, I'm sure most of you already know, and some of you are very familiar with the decision, but just in case you're not, Olmstead is the common way we refer to the Supreme Court case Olmstead versus LC, and June 22nd of this year marked its 15th anniversary. On that day, our nation's highest court affirmed what we disability rights advocates already knew and had been saying for a very long time, and that is that people with significant disabilities, like all people, have the right to live, work, and fully participate in their communities. And what exactly did the court mean by that? Well, the Olmstead decision established the legal precedent that publicly financed supports and services to folks with significant disabilities must be provided in the most integrated settings possible. And recent interpretations by the U.S. Department of Justice have made clear that this landmark Supreme Court decision applies to all services, programs, and activities of state and local governments, including employment and day services. In other words, it means that tax dollars should not be used to segregate. Rather, they should be used to facilitate services and supports for citizens with disabilities to thrive in typical community settings and to promote full engagement and participation of people with disabilities to live and work and earn like everyone else. Olmstead validated the notion that any investment in programs or services that lead to isolation or alienation of folks with significant disabilities is not only contradictory to America's norms of inclusion and equality, but also unconstitutional. Olmstead, in essence, set the stage for implementing one of the most challenging chapters in our nation's civil rights movement. Because it calls for major changes in the way government has traditionally addressed the needs of folks with disabilities, and it also requires all of us to, I think, really overcome historical misperceptions about limitations of people in general and people with disabilities in particular. In order to achieve the aims set out in the Olmstead integration mandate, we really have to transform our public systems to assist and support people with disabilities in much different ways than we have in the past. Services provided by government agencies really need to be focused on supporting people with disabilities to be meaningfully engaged in our communities, and that really does extend to employment, because for most of us, a big part of participating in the community is working in the community. And I think it's so interesting that we see that as the norm for non-disabled people, and when it comes to people with disabilities, you know, we have all kinds of excuses about why that isn't possible. As we all know from personal experience, employment is really the gateway to not only economic independence, but also social engagement. The Olmstead decision actually specifically addresses this important connection between living in the community and working in the community, noting that when work options are limited, so too are important everyday life activities. It's not really rocket science. Integrated employment is key to, I would say, to reversing this sort of negative cycle and pursuing integrated employment through systems change is our goal. It is the critical ingredient to ensuring that citizens with disabilities develop a full and meaningful life in the community. And that's why the Office of Disability Employment has made something called Employment First a major policy focus area in recent years. Employment First is a systems change approach to disability employment, clearly aligned with the intent of Olmstead. The first refers to the idea that integrated employment should be the first expected outcome for youth and adults with significant disabilities, and that public services should be prioritized to achieve this program goal. Now, I keep using the term integrated employment, and and you may be asking yourselves what I mean by that. Well, I mean work that is paid directly by employers at greater or minimum wage or prevailing wage with commensurate benefits and all the benefits that folks get while they work. Work that occurs in a typical work setting where the employee with a disability interacts or has the opportunity to interact continuously with coworkers without disabilities. Work that offers an opportunity for advancement and job mobility, and that is preferably full-time. Now, in many cases, maybe it won't be. Employment First started at the state level, and its merits quickly became obvious. Today, a majority of states are implementing collaborative service delivery strategies aligning policies and coordinating public resources across systems to make it happen. So what does that mean? It basically means that up until very recently, state systems haven't spoken to each other. And I was talking to my colleague Alison Barkoff, who you'll be hearing from later, who just came from Department of Justice and now is with the Bazelon Center. And she is really the expert on Olmstead. But the idea that services on the state level, folks actually speak to each other. So at ODEP we have our employment state leadership mentoring program where we're working with 4 states. We have a protege state of Washington State, and we have a mentor state, Washington State. We have 3 protege states, Oregon, Iowa, and Tennessee. And basically the idea is that by having systems speak to each other, for example, the rehab system, typically, and I'm really aiming this to the older folks in the room, but typically, the blind folks didn't speak to anybody, and the deaf folks didn't speak to anybody, and people with DD were over here, and people with other significant disabilities were in another silo. So the whole concept is that state systems start talking to each other. And as Allison and I were chatting before this event, we were talking about how we're kind of at this nexus point within disability history. And what I mean is there's just a lot of new regulations and laws coming on the books which are really promoting the concept of integrated employment. So we have the new Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which actually mentions integrated employment. And we're actually putting together an advisory committee. I'm sure many of you guys have seen the notice about it, to really kind of hone in on what integrated employment means and how, as a government, we can support this better, rather than just talking about it, but actually doing it and having our tax dollars we want to put our money where our mouth is. In the WIOA regulation, there's quite a few mentions of integrated employment, of a concept called customized employment. And then we have the CMS rules, the Home and Community-Based Services rules, which are also pushing the agenda of integrated employment. We have 503, which is the new regulation of the where the regulations have been updated and went into effect in March of this year. And it really is a game changer with regard to how businesses that are federal contractors pursue affirmative action, and how it's a game changer with regard to how they have to keep track and hire folks with disabilities, and really not talk about it, but again, do it. And at ODEP, I would say we've been working hard to support these state efforts to promote the principles of employment first nationally in a coordinated manner. For example, our Employment First State Mentoring Program, which I just mentioned, in addition to having our mentor state and protege states, we provide states with an intensive technical assistance training and coaching opportunity. And as part of this, we've developed a national employment first community of practice, and are really pleased to have 32 states currently participate. So there's a lot of states that applied to be protege states, but since we didn't have enough money to make them all protege states, we developed this community of practice, which gives states very intensive coaching to be able to kind of cross-pollinate their policies and services. And through these efforts, we've seen great results and major progress occurring in several pockets of the country. But we won't stop until the employment first philosophy is really adopted nationwide. We feel like, if we use the analogy of women, I was thinking this morning when I was listening to the news that Fortune magazine just came out with its top 50 business, top 50 most powerful business women. Thank you. And I was thinking, this is so significant to the work that we're doing here today, here at John Jay and also at ODEP. Because, 15, 20, 10, maybe 5 years ago, we saw this trend emerging of women, more women graduating from college, more women working out of the house than ever before in human history. But, in the 1920s, when women were trying to get the vote, there were people saying, why give women the vote? Why give women the opportunity to become more independent? And we're kind of there in the disability community. We have an old system, and I'm talking about employment, where in all good faith, President Roosevelt established a system in the 1930s to basically employ folks with disabilities and to provide benefits to federal contractors that hired people with disabilities. Well, in that era, that was probably a fair and decent solution. But we're in a new era now. And like the women, the 50 most powerful women, I see just the whole the boat being raised in terms of folks with disabilities, as it was for women, as it was for folks of color. And I think we have to look at it in those contexts. If you trace the history of women's work, and I don't need to go into this too much, but you look at in the 40s when a lot of men were out fighting the war, and there was kind of the Rosie the Riveter phase, right? All these women went and did all kinds of work. They kind of had to go back into their houses when the men came back so that they could take over the work. But then, very soon after that, I would say 15 years after that, women started questioning their role. And I think in terms of disability rights, we're at a place where we are questioning our role and questioning the level of expectation and questioning how our tax dollars sometimes can be, or how our tax dollars are used. Many times they're used, it's very complicated and confusing, because if you work, you're penalized, right? So at my level, we are having discussions with Social Security. The White House is aware that, that a lot of our disability laws are old, they're antiquated, they're out of date, they're counterproductive. We realize that we can no longer afford to keep people with disabilities out of work when they're perfectly capable of working. And the only way we're going to prove that people with disabilities are capable of working is when we work. I don't know if you know, some of you know my story, but way back when, in the dark ages, I was young, and when I got out of high school, I was tracked into a position at a lock factory. I ran a punch press, and what I did was, the punch press, I would put doorknobs into a press, and the press would go around and it would slice off the bottom of the doorknob. It was at Quickset Lock Factory in Anaheim, California, and that factory is still there. But that was the level of expectation that particular council had for me. Now, I don't know why, because in those days, blind women did one of three things. They were a teacher for the visually impaired, they were a typist in a typing pool, or they were a rehab counselor. I was never tracked into any of those fields. I was tracked into factory work. So, and even 20 years ago, I would still be, it was very common for people to assume that it was okay for me to make brooms. Even today, as I travel around the country, and for those of you who know me, you probably know that I very often travel alone. So when I go to an airport and people ask me, of course they immediately assume that I'm on vacation. And then I say no, and they say, what do you do? And I say, well, I work for the Department of Labor. Oh, really? What do you do there? Oh, I work in the area of disability. Well, what do you do? Well, I used to say I'm an assistant secretary. But because they didn't believe me, and because I got, there was like, oh, come on. I just say I'm Michelle Obama's makeup artist. So, we have a lot of work to do, and unfortunately, you guys, well, I shouldn't say unfortunately. We're very blessed that you guys are here to help do the work. But really, to change the attitudes and the expectations of society, we've come a long way. We've come a long way in that some of us have work. But we also know a few things. One, our benefit system cannot handle the weight that it is currently under with folks on disability. Two, it is possible for people with significant disabilities to work. We have to have that expectation to move the bar. Otherwise, people are going to be stuck in sheltered workshops and day programs. And for those who can be productive, and in my mind, that's most people. I mean, all of us can do something, right? I just think it's time, to raise the boat, to get out of, to kind of take the chains of the tyranny of low expectations off. And I was in Utah a couple weeks ago, actually last week, to see a project for my own, well, I would say with my own eyes, but you know what I mean, for myself, that is actually being sponsored by Source America. And as you know, Source America is the agency that works to help folks get, contractors get federal contracts. And very often people are paid sub-minimum wage. But they have a research institute that is doing some amazing things. And it's a concept called customized employment. And it's a brand new concept. And I think the thing that's interesting to me is that a lot of other businesses are doing it too, not just disability businesses. But this was one example that I saw of people with very significant disabilities working in mainstream jobs. And this is a test, it's a pilot program. But I was so impressed, and it really just made me even more committed to the concept of employment first and the presumption that people can work. So, we talk about, for those of you who are familiar with the settlement of the Department of Justice with the state of Rhode Island, basically, this is a real game changer too. The Department of Justice has mandated that Rhode Island close its sheltered workshops, and many folks have to be redressed for wages. And Rhode Island's on the path of completely changing how it hires and how it tracks and how it channels people with very significant disabilities. So it's going to be a 10-year process, and nobody's saying that this change is going to be easy or that it's going to happen overnight. It's not. But I actually visited Rhode Island with a bunch of folks to help launch this process of integrated employment, and how are they going to use their tax dollars to really support integrated employment. And the things that we saw there that are already happening are pretty amazing. And just the concept that we want people to be funneled, that we presume that people can work, and we presume that people are, that the first option should be integrated employment is a huge game changer. And there is a lot of resistance. Our own families are terrified in many cases, that their person, that their child or son or sorry, their loved one will not be safe. And of course, we're aware of that. And the families that I met in Utah, whose folks were either in day programs or just on a waiting list for a day program. There's one woman that I met that works for the Forest Service, and she's doing, she helps create posters now for them. And she was sitting at home doing absolutely nothing for about 8 years because she was on a waiting list for a day program. I met probably 7 more people like her in Utah, and then I met a few people who are in day programs who are now out and working in the community. I mean, this is Utah, people, Utah. And, you know, you got to give them credit because they're doing something very innovative and, you know, and in many ways very scary. You know, and people are going to criticize it. They're going to say, well, you know, it's too expensive. Well, that's, you know, that's what they said when they built women's bathrooms in the Senate. We have to put it in the context of race and gender, or we won't make any changes. When we think of the work that I'm looking for some notes here. Just one second, I'm sorry. So I want to talk about what CMS, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, how they're promoting the use of Medicaid waiver funds for home and community-based services to facilitate and support the integrated employment goals for folks with disabilities. The agency's September 2011 guidance on development and implementation of HCBS waivers was significant to the field because it reaffirmed the importance of competitive work for people with and without disabilities. And CMS's goal to promote integrated employment options through the waivers program. So that was very important. It also acknowledged the best and promising practices in employment support, including self-direction and peer support options. And this has been very helpful for people with psychiatric disabilities. It also emphasized the critical role of person-centered planning in achieving employment outcomes. So you can see that employment is important not only to the Department of Labor, but also to HHS, who actually spends much more money on quote-unquote employment than the Department of Rehab. In addition to the September 2011 informational bulletin, CMS recently released new regulations in January of this year governing home and community-based services to HCBS, clarifying that in order to receive federal HCBS, which stands for Home and Community-Based Services, funding for services to seniors and people with disabilities, states must ensure that those services are tailored to each individual's needs and provided in a setting that promotes community integration and employment. States must ensure that the HCBS recipients live in the setting of their choice and that those settings provide opportunities to these individuals to work in competitive integrated settings. So we're seeing the concept that people, we are seeing a change, that there's a presumption that people can work. And we are also seeing more and more, I would say, a collaboration between government agencies to facilitate this. The Department of Justice is supporting a community employment working group, which involves the Department of Labor, SSA, HHS, many different agencies, including CMS, but also the folks at the Administration on Community Living. So I think more than ever in the government, we are realizing that that the government needs to coordinate itself. When we talk about states coordinating their own tax dollars, we need to coordinate our tax dollars to increase employment for folks with disabilities in more integrated setting, which absolutely supports the mandate of the Olmstead decision. So I will stop there, and I would just say thank you all for the work that you're doing, and I especially want to thank John Jay College and the work that they are doing in increasing employment opportunities and increasing economic justice for people with disabilities. Thank you all very much.